After returning from a night to celebrate the arrival of the new year, my husband and I returned to our apartment complex to turn in for the night. We both had a couple of drinks, but neither of us were intoxicated. As much as we enjoy partying with friends, when it comes down to it, we are really just homebuddies. We lived in the corner penthouse suite of our complex. Although this was never confirmed, it was suspected the owners wanted to convert this apartment complex into condos. The rent certainly was not cheap, and access was limited to this floor. Upon entering the building, there is a walk-up to secure doors, and every now and then there would be a doorman to greet you as you entered or exited. There were also multiple security cameras placed throughout and around the building. It was an especially cold evening, and when we returned, there was no doorman present. It was late, at least 2:30 a.m. The foyer was empty, and one of the lights flickered softly. My husband and I entered the elevator and pressed the button to the top floor. The elevator ride was smooth, and as we ascended, I could feel myself becoming more relaxed, excited to finally be home and able to rest. My feet were killing me from wearing heels all night in the bitter cold. The bell chimed, signaling we had reached our floor. The door slid open, and we turned the corner to the left. Like I said, our suite was the corner suite at the end of the hall. However, something caught our eye. A woman, or what at least looked like a woman, was meandering through the hallway. Her hair was dark and scattered, it looked to be matted and covered her face. She wore a black lace dress that was torn and looked to be in bad shape. Thinking back, I don't even think she had any footwear on. We assumed she was intoxicated and was having difficulty finding her suite. Although on closer inspection, she didn't look familiar. We knew all of our neighbors, as, like I said, access was limited on this floor. I looked at my husband, who stood still as well. I could see he was contemplating the same thoughts. I asked him, should we ask if she needs help? He looked at me and said, just wait, maybe she's just drunk and having a hard time finding her suite. The woman just continued to slowly slide herself along the walls of the hallway, stopping at each door and peering through the exterior peepholes. Admittedly, this was creepy, but it just added to the theory that she was a drunk woman looking for her friends. She was humming, or what I believe was humming. The sound was something between a growl and a hum. We stood there in utter disbelief and awe. However, there was a veil of tension and uneasiness that lingered. The strange woman stumbled through the hallway, hunched over, until she pulled herself up to peer through the peephole. She eventually got to a suite of an elderly lady, whom I have a strong connection with. We'll just call her Evelyn. Evelyn was the sort of woman whose family had neglected her and rarely visited. She would bring my husband and me baked goods from time to time. I would bring her leftovers and assist her with groceries and medication. Frequently, Evelyn's smoke alarm would constantly go off. I would have to rush over and pull out the smoldering toast from her toaster and fan her smoke alarm until it stopped beeping. At times, a nuisance, but it would always turn into tea time. Nevertheless, I cared about Evelyn. So when I saw this strange woman peer into her peephole, I reacted. I blurted out, "Excuse me, are you all right?" I could feel myself lose confidence as I asked. The strange woman seemed to shudder for a moment and hunched over to the floor. She looked like she was about to puke or was frightened by my voice. My husband and I stepped closer, but the woman then let out a series of soft and menacing laughs, just barely audible. I have to admit, in this moment I was thoroughly creeped out and reached for my cell phone. It was uncomfortable because we couldn't get to our suite. Without having to walk right past this deranged woman, my husband said, "Hey, did you hear us? Do you need help?" Her laugh began to grow into what was a steady cackle. The strange woman then stood up. As she stood up, her cackle became a mixture between a cackle and a boisterous growl. She then stumbled forward and continued walking down the hall. There was a staircase just outside of our suite. I assumed she was making her way to the stairs, just too embarrassed to walk past us to the elevator. Maybe she was just a drunk woman, and this was nothing more than an uncomfortable standoff with a sad and intoxicated woman. I mean, if she was really that drunk, the stairs probably weren't a good idea. We were on the 7th floor. Nevertheless, I just didn't feel like it was worth the risk to engage with this woman. I just wanted to enter my suite and dive into bed. It was late, and my feet still hurt. As we took a few steps forward, the woman stopped, almost with laser precision. She stood up completely straight, looked right at our door, and then began to pound on our door, screaming bloody murder. I could feel myself becoming swallowed with fear. I reached for my cell phone and began to dial 911. The woman kept pounding on our door and screaming. To be honest, I'm surprised none of our neighbors came out to see what was happening. Part of me thinks they were too afraid themselves and were probably peering out of their peepholes. Afraid of what our neighbors would think, my husband said, "Hey, what are you doing? Stop that." And just like that, the strange woman stopped, fell to the ground, and began crawling quickly towards us. She looked up for a brief second. All I could see were her dark eyes. Her mouth seemed to be stained black, and she was growling again, but this time it was as if there was something in her throat that she was choking on. Frozen with fear, my husband and I just watched until she flashed us a menacing hiss, the kind you would hear in a movie but never imagined in real life. Terrified, I whipped off my shoes, and my husband and I ran towards the staircase on the other side of the building. We didn't want to risk waiting for the elevator and have her catching up. We went down 2 flights of stairs and stopped to listen if she was making her way down the stairs, but it was almost impossible to hear as my heart was pounding so hard. I thought to myself, what the hell was going on? We waited there for 10 minutes or so until eventually, we had the courage to head up the stairs and back to our suite. The woman was gone, and so we entered our suite. I was just relieved to finally be safe in my home. My husband sent a text to our landlord, and he replied that we would hear from him in the morning. I was so unbelievably exhausted but found it incredibly difficult to sleep. The sound of that woman's growling and cackling rang in my ears. I hardly slept. The next day, when my husband went to speak to the landlord, he asked him to check the security cameras. Although nothing turned up, the landlord said the cameras glitched due to the frigid temperatures last night. To this day, I still don't know what to think. That woman most certainly had problems. The question is, was she dangerous? We moved about a year later, but every New Year's Eve, I still think about that night. It was New Year's Eve of 2020, and all of us were ready for this horrible year to be over. When I was 12, the dawning of a new millennium took place on New Year's Eve. While people were fearing the worst with the Y2K bug or out partying and drinking, I was home alone. In 1996, my parents had split up, and from there, they divorced. My mother and I moved across the country from Oregon to Tennessee with her best friend. On the eve of the year 2000, I was home alone and my mother was currently out of state. Now, this didn't worry me as this was not the first time. I often came home to find a note on the kitchen counter saying that they had gone to Florida for a few days and that there were groceries in the fridge. Since the divorce, she was habitually leaving me alone for long periods of time to go to Florida. We lived on a relatively quiet road surrounded by trees and set a few miles out of town. I knew most of the people, if not by name then by face, enough to wave and have a small chat with. I had never been given a reason to be afraid of being alone. On the night in question, I was staying up late watching television. I remember I was watching the movie His Bodyguard on the USA channel, and I had most of the lights on in the house. Not because I was afraid, but because at 12, I wasn't concerned with the electricity bills or even saving the environment. I felt completely safe and protected within my little bubble of home. As I was watching the movie, I kept hearing these weird sounds outside, but I remember thinking it was probably the neighbors. Though they weren't extremely close, a couple of them were having a party or people over for the holiday. About halfway into the movie, however, the power in the house suddenly went dead. I sat on the couch for a minute, just sort of in a panic daze because it was near midnight and pitch black. I remember thinking the power must have gone out and that it would come back on, so I just decided to sit on the couch with my blanket and wait. A few minutes passed by when I heard a noise in the kitchen where the back door is. My heart started racing in my chest because I thought it sounded like the back door being shut. The back door sits just off of the dining room, which is connected to the kitchen and leads directly into the living room where I was currently sitting on the couch. A few seconds passed after I heard the sound, and I was straining my ears to pick up anything that wasn't supposed to be there. Every noise suddenly felt magnified. When footsteps sounded on the floor, I immediately slithered off of the couch onto all fours, crawled around the ottoman, and started, as slowly and as quietly as I could, to make my way toward the space between the love seat and the couch. I knew I could fit under the side table and be completely hidden by the dark and the ottoman from playing hide and seek in the dark many times with my friends during sleepovers. I was nearly there when the footsteps became more apparent. I knew from the sound of them that whoever it was making their way through the kitchen now toward the living room. They weren't hurried or anything, it was just like they were moving around in the kitchen. I glanced up from where I was crouched on the floor, and to my horror, there was a dark silhouette standing in the doorway between the two rooms. To my credit, I didn't scream, however, I did panic. I stood immediately to my feet from my hiding spot and I ran down the hallway. I believe the only reason I wasn't grabbed by now is because the person chasing me had to get around the ottoman in the dark to follow me. I did what all children would do when they're afraid. I bypassed the front door, the guest bedroom, the bathroom, and I ran to the farthest door down the hallway, my room. In all honesty, I probably wouldn't have been able to get the front door unlocked and open in time as it was right off the side of the couch. As I ran into the room, I slammed the door shut and locked it. However, the lock was simply one of those little turn knobs that you can easily pop with a butter knife. I had barely gotten the door shut and locked and the person on the other side knocked on it. I have no idea why they knocked, if they did it to mock me or to scare me, but I knew in my heart that my little lock was not going to keep whoever it was on the other side out of my room. It didn't keep my mother out when we were arguing, and it certainly wouldn't stand up to brute force. I was panicking and on the verge of tears when the person started laughing. That after he had stopped, though being under my bed gave me no feelings of being secure. I didn't come out from under it because I simply had nowhere else to go. I thought about trying to go out the window, but I was afraid he might expect it and therefore be waiting for me on the other side. It was also several feet off the ground as the house was built on a raised foundation. I remember laying under my bed, terrified, for what felt like hours. At some point, I must have fallen asleep because I awoke the next morning to daylight. The fear of what had happened came back to me as soon as I registered where I was and why. Scared that whoever had been in my house might still be there, I decided to crawl out the window and run to a neighbor since it was daylight outside and therefore I felt less afraid. Crawling out this kind of window was a lot harder than it looks, and I did it less than gracefully as I was not, and still am not, the most coordinated person. Once I was back on my feet, however, I carefully made my way around the house. That's when I noticed that the back door was wide open. Scared but feeling braver now that I was outside and that it was morning instead of pitch black night, I walked back up the steps and started peering inside. Seeing nothing out of the ordinary, meaning no terrifying man leering at me basically, I decided to go inside. Looking back, I cringe at how stupid this could have turned out, and I wish I would have told my younger self to make the smarter move and just go get help. But thankfully, no one was inside the house. I did a terrifying, heart-pounding room-to-room check, looking in closets and under beds, behind the couch, and anywhere I thought even a small child might be able to fit. I even popped the lock on my mom's bedroom so I could check it, and then relocked it afterward. When I was positive there was no one there, I went back to lock the back door. I had left it open in case I needed to escape, and I noticed that the breaker box on the opposite wall was open. The main switch had been pulled. I flipped it back on, locked both locks on the back door, and checked all the windows and front door. Then I called my mom, where I once again broke down crying hysterically. She called a coworker, who came and stayed the entire day with me as they drove back. My mom still took random trips to Florida after that, but I always went with her from then on. This past New Year's was my and my boyfriend's 4-year anniversary. We typically don't do much, so this year, we decided to make it special by planning a romantic getaway. At the time, the two of us were living in Seattle, and we wanted to rent a cabin in a snowy small town for the weekend. We found a cabin on Airbnb with a hot tub, and we were sold. The cabin was, of course, the last house on the road. To get to it, you had to drive down a small remote private road that ended in a roundabout. Off the roundabout was a long uphill driveway leading up to our cabin. We got to the cabin, and it was snowy and beautiful. The cabin itself sat on top of a garage, and you needed to take stairs on the back side of the property to get to the front door. When we got inside, there was a booklet with all the cabin's info outlined. The book said that during the snowy season, don't be surprised if their contracted snow plowers showed up to clear off the driveway. Okay, sounds good. So we unpacked and realized that there was no service on either of our phones, but the booklet told us that there was a landline in the cabin if we needed anything. We spent the first night by the fire, playing board games and drinking wine. The weekend was exactly what we needed. We planned to spend the next day in town, and that night I had booked us a reservation for a nice dinner. We were gone almost all day, only returning briefly to get dressed up to enjoy some good food. Dinner was great, and we were excited to head back to the cabin for some champagne and hot tubbing. While at dinner, the temperature had dropped, and it snowed for the first time that day, coating everything in a fresh layer of powder. We drove down the private road and got to the driveway. At that point, my boyfriend stopped the car, headlights shining in front, and asked if I noticed the new tire tracks. I looked at the driveway, hoping to quickly disregard the new tire tracks, but there they were. Immediately, we remembered that the snow plowers could have stopped by, but the issue was we saw the tire tracks because of the snow, and who plows in the dark. We also knew that once we were at the cabin, we had no service on our cell phones. So we figured we would head back into town and message our Airbnb host and ask if they or any of their friends had stopped by. We waited for a while in town for a reply from our host, but we didn't hear back. We could have called, but at that point, it was past 10, and we didn't want to be bad guests. We figured we blew the whole thing out of proportion and might as well head back to the cabin. After all, I am big into true crime and spooky subreddits and horror movies, so I was probably just psyching myself out. My boyfriend drove us back. This time, we actually drove up the driveway towards the top of the hill. Part of the driveway, though, I noticed something. My stomach dropped as I noticed footprints on the property. We backed down the driveway and took a closer look to see if there were any more footprints. From what it looked like, someone had driven up the driveway, then reversed down, parked, and then got out of the car and walked all around the property. The property was quite large, with tons of trees and brush, and we knew that these footprints could go anywhere. The moment we saw the footprints, we decided to call the police. We figured it was better safe than sorry, and we would just have the officer go onto the property with us to check everything out. We drove down the road till we got service, called the police, and waited for their arrival. The policeman showed up, and we followed him onto the property. The officer scanned the property and determined there was no one out there. Obviously, we were a little bit shaken up and very embarrassed. We thanked the officer as he left. Needless to say, neither of us wanted to sit in a hot tub in the dark woods after what had happened. Instead, we locked the doors and watched a movie with champagne. We were both tired from the day and passed out pretty quickly. At 2 a.m., we both woke up on the couch with the TV on and all the lights laughing about how the night didn't turn out as planned. As my boyfriend went to brush his teeth, we heard a noise. It sounded mechanical and only lasted a few seconds. We looked at each other and froze. The garage door, There are very few reasons that someone would need to open the garage door of a guest-occupied Airbnb at 2 o'clock in the morning. Like I said, we woke up with all of the lights on, and the cabin had lots of windows. We knew that if someone was outside, they knew that we were here and that they could see us. I immediately grabbed the landline and dialed 911. Once again, we sat crouched in the Airbnb, praying for the police to arrive. We knew that whoever had made those tracks was still on the property, and this time they were making noise. As I sat talking to the operator, we heard a bang on our balcony as if someone was throwing something up onto it. I was losing my absolute mind when the operator told me the police were nearby. All of a sudden, they were there. We saw the police lights and watched them search everything. Then, soon, we heard banging on the door. It was the police, and we were okay now. At the door were two policemen, one in front of us and one a little behind, kind of kicking around the snow and looking at the ground. I immediately noticed the police officer in the back as the officer who did the initial check on the property. The officer told us that not only was the garage door shut, but it was locked, and again, there were no signs of someone on the property. We discussed leaving, but the officer said the road conditions were too dangerous at that time of night. I looked at the officer who had to come out to the property twice, and I felt I had deeply disappointed him. My boyfriend and I went back inside, locking all the doors again, and we tried to sleep. The next day, we were leaving. While we survived the night, I didn't feel right in the cabin anymore. It was forever the spooky cabin in my head, and I just wanted to leave. As we packed, we heard the same noise that we heard at 2 a.m. That's when I had the realization that it was the heater all that time. It was just the heater in the garage making this noise. My boyfriend looked at me and immediately said, "You need to give up your murder shows," and then walked away. As for the banging on the balcony, it was just a perfectly timed fall of a pine cone. I promise I'm not paranoid. I think back on this story a lot and I'm embarrassed about how little came of it, but also incredibly grateful for the same reason. Thanks for watching the video. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to watch the latest videos.